So today we're going to sort of deepen our questioning of exactly why the countries of West Africa have had such a difficult path to development. We looked at the failed state index, and we see that these countries, many of them, have remained in the same position with respect to many of the criteria for decades. And we know from Why Nations Fail, from the book we were reading at the beginning of the course, that this is not anything to do with culture. It's nothing to do with the environment, but it has very much to do with governance and the way that that these countries are run. There are also other reasons and other participants in the development or the lack of development of these countries. And ironically, as is pointed out in Van de Walle book, these culprits, if you will, are the very same organizations that are dedicated to global development. So we need to look at what the problem is. I mean, it's a bit paradoxical to think that that the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund are actually impediments to development, but there's a growing feeling among a number of observers that in fact is the case. So anyway, we'll take a look at this in this lecture. But first, we'll say, okay, what happened in Africa at the end of colonialism? Well, the colonial period started to end in the 1950s, and it sort of rolled through Africa up through the 1980s. However, when these countries came out of the colonial web, they got caught up in the Cold War, where the United States and Russia and even China were competing, to get these countries lined up on in one or several blocks that existed in the world at that time. So in effect, a lot of these countries were encouraged either to become socialistic or to become staunchly anti-communist, and they were being paid and supported by the superpowers, which actually wasn't very good for their internal development. But then after the Soviet Union collapsed, we see many of these states. We look at Sierra Leone, we look at Liberia, we look at the Congo. We see that these states plunged into a state of anarchy, while many others were mired in debt or conflict, and perhaps you can say places like Botswana, Mauritius, and post-apartheid South Africa escape some of this, but many of the problems are very similar. One note, a historical note, is that in the 1960s, the West African country of Ghana was actually more economically advanced than South Korea. But by the year 2000, obviously South Korea had left Ghana in the dust, and that is it's something we really want to understand what happened. Asamoglu and Robinson have something to say about this. They talk about the strong institutions that existed in South Korea, the focus on education, the focus on exports, the support of the United States, and some regional issues. So but nevertheless, if we were to ask Asamoglu and Robinson what happened at the end of colonialism, they would say that that these countries inherited the worst of the colonial system in terms of giving power into the hands of elite, while not creating a system that was fair and equitable. So in steps the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. Both of these organizations arose out of post-World War II Europe with the real goals on the part of the International Monetary Fund to promote international cooperation, monetary cooperation, and financial stability, while the World Bank was set up to basically give loans by investing in infrastructure, investing in education, and more recently, really looking at the governance issues. And I encourage you to look at the websites for both those organizations, to see in detail what it is that they do. One of the programs, though, of these international financial institutions is structural adjustment, and you'll read about that in the Vandewala book, and he really gives it a strong emphasis in terms of explaining what happened to these African economies, and why did they receive all of this foreign aid and all of this attention from the IFIs, but still really didn't move the needle much on on some of the basic development issues. So let's look at the components of structural adjustment. I mean, structural adjustment is a program that these international financial institutions basically imposed upon the poor countries, in Africa, Latin America, Asia. It wasn't just an African phenomena. And they said basically, we'll continue to subsidize you, we'll continue to provide you a whole range of assistance, but you have to do the following. You have to reduce the cost of your government. You have to devalue your currency and encourage exports, rather than subsidizing internal producers or internal farmers. You have to remove your restrictions on currency. Your currency has to be allowed to float internationally. You have to reduce a whole range of subsidies. Price subsidies, subsidies for special interest and price controls. You have to privatize state-owned industries. In a lot of post-colonial countries, they adopted a socialistic model where the government was actually running businesses, and for the IFIs, that's a no-no, and the companies had to sell off these enterprises. What happened, as we saw, in Africa, but also in Russia, was that these businesses were sold off to the friends of the elite, and didn't really promote free enterprise. Then they had to reduce the difficulties that foreign firms had in entering domestic markets. They had to downsize their government, slim down their bureaucracies, expand their tax base, implement fee-for-service regimes, and things like education and healthcare. And again, I mean, in a lot of countries in the developing world, the government tries to buy the peace by making education very cheap, making healthcare very cheap. Two problems in that. One is that the education and healthcare systems aren't very good because there's very little investment in it, and secondly, the government is basically forced to manage these things, and they're often not managed in a very good way. But the bottom line is that they want to promote these free market principles. So how did these structural adjustment programs affect the politics of these post-colonial countries? We have a lot of criticism, as I've said, and two of the critics, Dambiso Moyo, who's a Zambian economist, and an NYU economist named Bill Easterly, who's quite famous for his criticism of these organizations. They said that these programs created disincentives for entrepreneurs. They created dependencies on these IFIs. And, according to Vandewala, his main point is that they only encourage partial reform, that these countries would reform only enough to keep the aid money flowing, but really didn't get into the the fundamental issues. So when Vandewala talks about partial reform, he means that basically that the oligarchs and the elites in certain sub-Saharan countries have used these reform programs to maintain themselves in power, to enrich themselves, and only reform themselves enough to keep the money flowing. The significance of this is that we can we could say that these programs, in many cases, not all cases, but in many cases, certainly in these in these countries at the bottom of the failed state index, all of whom are clients of the World Bank and the IFIs to one degree or another, that these programs did not meet their objectives, and that we can legitimately question the judgment and the competence of these organizations, and that but to their defense, they are also always examining what happens, and the worst impacts of structural adjustment have been looked at and modified, and so as even though they haven't really backed away from those types of programs, they've tried to implement them in a much more pro-poor way